Hello, and welcome to a new episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. I'm your host, Margaret Edwards, and this week we are going to be talking about the legislative process. As we shared last week, Congress is on August recess, and they are still on August recess. The Senate is expected to be back in session on September the 13th, and the House of Representatives is expected to be back on September 20th. So in the meantime, we're going to take this opportunity to talk about the legislative process. And I hope that, walking through the steps on how a bill becomes a law will be helpful in highlighting areas where NSPE can exert some of our influence to impact what legislation is being passed and to make changes that we want to see. So to begin, I'm sure, we are familiar with the Schoolhouse Rock video on, how a bill becomes law, called I'm Just a Bill. I'm sure as much as we wish we could just have a sing along and that could fulfill, trying to teach you and trying to, shed some light on the legislative process. It's kind of time to demystify it a bit. We are today going to dive a few layers deeper than what the Schoolhouse Rock video covers. So without further ado, let's start talking about the legislative process. But before doing so, I kind of want to take a step back and talk about the types of legislation. There are, whenever it comes to types of legislation, there are more than just bills. So the first two are bills and joint resolutions. These two, do ultimately become law and, have the end goal of becoming law. These will eventually go to the president for their signature or veto, and will either, become law or not on the end of that journey. And then the next, and one thing that I want to add about joint resolutions are any constitutional amendments must be drafted as joint resolutions. The final two on our list are simple resolutions and concurrent resolutions. These two are usually related to more operational aspects of Congress. They do not carry the weight of law upon passage. They never actually even make it to the president's desk. That's just kind of procedurally how these types of legislation are built. Simple resolutions are limited to one chamber in Congress and only apply to the chamber in which they are passed. And then concurrent resolutions relate to both chambers and then apply to both chambers once they're passed. An example of a concurrent resolution is the budget resolution, which, if you remember from past episodes of Committee Corner, it's the budget resolution is pretty much like a handshake agreement of this is how we're going to proceed with the budget this year. So now let's kind of dive into the legislative process. What you see here are kind of the high points that we are going to hit and provide a little bit more detail to of the legislative process. So the first step that we have is kind of introduction and referral of legislation. Upon a member introducing a bill, it will then be referred to a committee, and the relevant committee that it goes to usually has jurisdiction of that area. And then, now we're at this next step, which is committee consideration. And then the committee can do a few things with the bill. They might send it down to a subcommittee, that has a little bit more like refinement and a refined focus on the policy area that the bill deals with. And then multiple things can happen. They can hold hearings on the piece of legislation. That can be done to learn more about the intent of the bill, the impacts of the bill, so on and so forth. But really the final step of all of this is to mark up and eventually report the bill. In a markup, members of the committee have opportunities to amend the legislation, to make changes to the legislation, but to also voice their support or opposition to a certain bill. And then at the end of a markup, there's always a vote. And the vote is on final passage out of the committee. And if a committee were to favorably report a bill, It will then make its way to the floor of whichever chamber it originates in. For this example, we are walking through a bill that originates in the House, so then it would go to the House floor for consideration. There are a few different mechanisms for bringing a bill to the floor of the House. The first is that leadership can just schedule an expedited floor procedure. So if House leadership is like, oh, this bill's important, we want to pass this right away so we can get it to the Senate and they can take action. It will just go to the floor, be taken up with a vote. And then the next step is, the Rules Committee will, or another option, sorry, not the next step, another option is the Senate Rules Committee will take it up and will provide directions for how the bill will be brought up on the floor. It will determine the amount. The rule itself will determine the amount of time for debate, as well as what amendments can be made, how the amendments can be made, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the House floor consideration, there's a vote on final passage. And if the House moves to pass a bill, it then moves on to the next step. And the next step in kind of following this imaginary bill that we are following through the legislative process, it goes to the Senate for the Senate's consideration. There are kind of like two paths a bill can take once it gets to the Senate. In most cases, it will go to a committee and then go through the same committee consideration, the same type of committee consideration that it went through over in the House of Representatives. Again, that's also opportunities for amendment, for changes to be made, and then it'll eventually make its way back to the Senate floor, or it can immediately be taken up on the Senate floor through a series of procedural moves by Senate leadership. And those must pass in order for it to be brought up on the floor. And so once it's brought to the floor, at the end of floor consideration on the Senate, where there's also opportunities to amend and change the language, there's ultimately voting on final passage. And voting on the final passage of the bill can do one of two things. If there are no changes to the language that came over from the House of Representatives, the bill would go right to the president and for their action and their role in the legislative process. Or if not, if changes were made in the Senate, the House and Senate then need to resolve their differences. And so the resolution of differences can be done in a variety of ways. The first is simply sending the new and amended language from the Senate back to the House of Representatives for a vote. The next opportunity is an amendment exchange, where it'll go back to the House will make some changes, that it wants, then it goes back to the Senate will make some changes, and kind of, bounces back and forth until final language is agreed to. Or the final option is a conference committee. And in the conference committee, representatives from both the House and the Senate will get together in a room, kind of hash out all the differences and agree to one version of the legislative text. That version of the legislative text will then go to both the House and the Senate, and then they will vote on final passage. Once both houses agree to that language, it then reaches the final step of the legislative process, in which it goes to the president's desk for the signature or veto of the president. And the president kind of has a couple options. This is really where checks and balances comes into play in the legislative process. The president can, either one, sign the bill into law, and congratulations, we have a law. Or the president can veto a bill. And whenever it comes to a presidential veto, the president can just simply veto, send it back. It's not becoming law today. And then Congress kind of has a few opportunities to maybe make this bill happen. They can either send it back to committee. The committee can then work on the bill, make some changes that the president can eventually be happy enough with to sign the bill into law, or Congress can work to override that veto. And a veto override requires a 2/3 majority vote in each chamber in order for a bill to pass. So it has to have overwhelming enough support in in both chambers for a bill to for a veto to be overridden by Congress. So again, like this final step is really where checks and balances come into play, and that system really brings itself to life. So with that kind of walks through the legislative process. Hopefully at the end of this, the bill has made its way through. It has become a law. It didn't die or fail at the many chances that it kind of has to do so, and it has stayed alive throughout this legislative process. So with that, I hope that again shed some light on where NSPE as an organization can kind of take an opportunity and present its opinions in the legislative process and ultimately affect change. So with that concludes this episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. I hope you enjoyed learning about the legislative process. And so please be sure to tune in to our next episode. You can find the Committee Corner in the NSPE Advocacy Center or on the NSPE YouTube page. Thank you.